Okay, and so for Chapter 2, we're going to be talking about psychodynamic and cognitive theories of coping. So psychodynamic theories of coping, these emphasize the role of ego defense and specify some coping responses as being better or more mature than others. So there's better versus worse coping styles in this case. Cognitive theories, in contrast, emphasize the cognitive processes, so the thinking patterns, as intermediating external stressors and an individual's emotional and behavioral responses. In these theories, there is no better or worse, but rather a best fit for whatever you're dealing with at the time. We're going to be specifically talking about two theories of coping. For the psychodynamic theory of coping, we're going to be specifically discussing Hahn's tripartite model of coping. And then for a cognitive coping model, we'll be discussing Lazarus's and Folkman's theory of coping. I have to admit, though, before we get started here too far, is that I do have a bias in my thinking. I am trained as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, and so my tendency is to be more supportive of the cognitive processes of coping, and that's where most of my knowledge base sits as well. I'm aware of this bias. I think that both theories make a whole lot of sense and are very worthwhile in terms of understanding coping. And so I'm going to try and minimize these biases in my thinking and my presentation as much as possible. Having said that, they might still come out in my lecture. I challenge you to either ignore them, if that's the easiest way for you, or challenge me on them during our discussion sessions. Either way, I do know they're happening. I am trying to minimize them, and I would appreciate any discussion you want to initiate about it as well. Important for us to all remember, myself included, is that Hahn is definitely not Freud and differs from him in her way of thinking in some very important ways, and you want to review those ways on page 30 of your textbook. So let's get going in discussing Hahn's tripartite model of coping. The first most basic thing is she discusses ego processes. Ego processes are a basic strategy used to solve significant and mundane problems in daily living. These processes help a person to maintain a consistent sense of self and realistic connection to the environment. So, for Hahn, maintain a consistent sense of self is going to be important to remember throughout, because that's the aim of coping from Hahn's perspective. So, how do we do this? Well, Hahn specifies three main modes of ego functioning, including coping, defense, and fragmentation. Coping. This is problem solving in ways that are purposeful and flexible. Defense. Defense behavior is bound and rigid. These processes don't necessarily effectively manage emotion. They might distort emotion or the person's interpersonal reality. This might, for example, look like denial of an illness, which is something we'll talk more about later on in the course when we discuss HIV. This is where we see denial or this defense processes tends to come more into play. And finally, fragmentation. This involves behavior that is ritualistic and automated, so for example, withdrawing from one's world rather than taking the appropriate course of action to manage one's chronic illness. So, these three basic modes of ego functioning are further broken down by Hahn into 10 basic functions, and they're categorized into 4 different ways. Now, I'm not going to go into the 10 basic functions because honestly, 6 of them haven't even been supported in the research. And so let's just talk about the 4 different categorizations, because that gives you kind of a basic idea of what these 10 basic functions are and what they look like. Okay? So these categories are cognitive, reflexive interoceptive functions, attention focusing functions, and then affective impulse regulating. Cognitive functions involve an active attempt to problem solve around the stressor. So try to fix the stressor or solve it. So for example, they might help the individual to adapt or change his or herself in order to manage the stressor. Reflexive interoceptive functions help the individual to maintain their self-reflexive ability. So this means how much the person is absorbed by his or her inner thoughts, desires, or wants. How much do those take over? Attention focusing functioning, basically how the individual attends to the reality or the stressor or not. Some people don't attend to it at all. They don't pay attention to it at all. And then effective impulse regulating functions. These are the ego processes whose main function is managing emotion. When we talk about affect, another word for affect is emotion. So, Hahn's model focuses on understanding stress by first examining how someone even decides something is stressful. According to Hahn, stressful experiences are construed by the individual. So we evaluate something as being stressful or not. And so there's some variability between individual and individual in terms of what is and is not considered stressful. Although she will and does say that there are some experiences that probably would be considered, universally stressful by many people. For example, engaging in active combat and war. But mostly she emphasizes that there's some individual variability in what we perceive stressful or not. According to Hahn, once we identify something as a stressor, we then use the processes of assimilation and accommodation to adapt to the stressor. So, assimilation involves integrating new information into already existing schemas or constructs. Schema and constructs, if you remember from early courses, are how we organize our world, make sense of our world. Accommodation involves creating new constructs to help integrate new experiences. Both of these processes can be thwarted depending on the environmental conditions. So, for example, assimilation is more difficult to achieve if the aversive event was not planned, or if we were hoping for a good outcome and it didn't happen. When there's no control over the occurrence of an event, so it's happening to us, or when the situation is ambiguous, difficult to interpret. Also difficult to achieve when the situation is assumed to be stressful. So before you even experience the situation, you expect to feel stressed. Or when the situation is analogous to another aversive and unresolved event, when this individual is already stressed at the time of this new stressor, and finally when important information can't be secured, it's harder for us to achieve assimilation. Accommodation to stress is more difficult in the following circumstances: when the person has only limited control to decrease the amount of stress. So, for example, no matter how hard I try to fix it, the stress is just there and at the same level. Or when the stress is highly noxious, so especially uncomfortable. Or finally, when there's no prior experience with a certain type of stress. So it's hard to know how to manage it in that case. So let's now move on to Lazarus and Folkman's theory of coping. So, key terms to know. According to Lazarus and Folkman, the things that really impact coping are emotions, coping, and then appraisal. So emotions, these are complex reactions consisting of cognitive appraisals, action impulses or behaviors, and pattern somatic reactions. So in English, basically what they're saying is that emotions are comprised of our thinking, our behavior, and our physical responses. An example might be increased heart rate. That's a typical physical response to a stressor or an emotion. Coping, this is how we think about or what we do about external or internal demands to our personal resources, especially if those demands are viewed as exceeding our personal resources. So we don't have enough emotionally available or just literal resources available to handle that stressor. Appraisal, this is an evaluation or judgment about the personal significance of an event. So let me provide you with an example. If I see a car accident in my rear view mirror, I will make a judgment of how that accident impacts me or not. If it's a stranger and I know I can't do CPR and I'm not going to be able to help, and somebody's already called 911 because I can see them on their cell phone, then I might decide that this is not personally relevant to me. Now, how might this judgment change if the person driving behind me was, say, my husband? versus if it was just a stranger. So we make two kinds of appraisals, primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. Primary appraisal is an estimation of the stress potential of an encounter that determines both the kind of emotion experienced and the strength of the emotional reaction. Secondary appraisal is the individual's evaluation of his or her resources. So can I function? The coping options available, and the environment's probable reaction to these options if executed. So what will be the consequence in the environment? It's important to remember in Lazarus and Folkman's theory that there is no such thing as a good or bad coping response. So coping is just a response to a condition, a thought, an emotion. And it's not just a response to only an emotion as initially believed. So it's a response to a cognition or an emotion, but we originally thought it was just an emotion. Lazarus and Folkman specify two specific coping styles, problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping, and kind of part of that is avoidance-focused coping. So, problem-focused coping is when people attend carefully to the stressful event and try to take effective actions. We're more likely to use this form of coping when we feel a sense of control over a situation, when we think we can change the circumstances or at least change ourselves to be more capably dealing with that circumstance or that situation. So, for example, studying hard for an upcoming exam will help to decrease stress or anxiety related to the exam. The problem is, or I guess the utility of this strategy can be limited if, say, there is no solution to the situation. For example, the loss of a parent is something most people will have to cope with at some point in their life. There's no solution to such a loss, and thus other forms of coping might actually be better adapted. Emotion-focused coping is in which people try to weaken their emotional reaction, but they don't try to solve the emotional or the underlying problem. We use this style of coping when we cannot or believe we cannot change a situation. So, for example, if I'm in a hurry to get to an appointment and become stuck in a traffic on a bridge, that's an unchangeable, though hopefully temporary, situation. To cope, I might, for example, sing along to the radio. It's not going to take away the stressor, the traffic, or being late to my appointment, but it might provide me with an emotional release from the stress. Cookie Monster provides us with another good example. Cookie Monster, pictured, might be feeling really nervous about an upcoming examination or a presentation he has to give in class. Rather than practice for the presentation to make sure he feels confident in his material, he decides to eat a bunch of cookies. It doesn't provide him with a solution to the problem, won't help him give a better presentation, but I bet it feels good or at least tastes good. Avoidance coping it's under emotion-focused coping, and this includes strategies of denial, mental or behavioral disengagement, or wishful thinking to just not deal with whatever the stressor is. It might be useful when negotiating short-term stressors. So, for example, I used to get very sick in the car when I was a child, and so I would go to sleep every time I got into the car in order to avoid the stressor of feeling sick. It was adaptive for a short period of time. It wouldn't be adaptive, say, if I was the one driving the car and I decided to fall asleep. So, in general, you want to remember that the degree or the adequacy of or the effectiveness of each coping strategy depends basically on what the stressor is that's being managed. So like I mentioned before, there is no such thing as good or bad coping responses. Having said that, I will argue, just as your book mentions, that there is one form of coping considered bad. It is an avoidance or emotion-focused coping, and that is the use of alcohol or drug use to cope. It turns out that those consistently come out with negative outcomes with no positive solutions or outcomes emotionally, behaviorally, or otherwise when used to manage stressors. And so we would say that although blanket statement is true that there is no good or bad coping response, the use of drugs or alcohol tends to be considered good or bad.